Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Barber, manager at Coronado and Historic Site. Today, we're continuing our lecture series looking at unexpected histories or lesser-known histories about the colonization and conquest of the New World. Last time I spoke directly about conquistadors you probably have never heard of. Today, I'd like to take two conquistadors that everybody in New Mexico should know a lot about and tell you a story you probably have never heard about these people. In New Mexico, we tend to focus on the years 1540 to 1542 in regards to what happened in New Mexico. But actually, in many ways, is pivotal to the story as Coronado's exploration of New Mexico is what happens in central Mexico while Coronado is gone. And the events associated with central Mexico during this period. At the same time, the Tiwa War is waging in New Mexico. The Mixton War is going strong in an area of what is then northern New Spain. So the Mixton War was a rebellion by primarily Chichimec peoples, including the Coxcanes and Zacatecas. These are the indigenous peoples in and around Guadalajara and Zacatecas. Fighting of the Mixton War occurred between 1540 and 1542 and was centered on a hill depicted here in this image known as Cerro del Tuche near Nochoslan in Zacatecas. The war included tens of thousands of Native American combatants on both sides, and it was really a precursor to the later guerrilla conflict known as the Chichimeca War. And we'll discuss both in this lecture. So we're going to be looking at, first and foremost, we're going to explore the characters and causes which led to the war. And if you can imagine right now, the characters are Onate and Coronado, but there'll be some other people in the story as well. And then we will examine the specifics of the Native American uprising and how it both shaped and was shaped by contemporaneous events. And then lastly, we will look specifically at how this war affected the settling of New Mexico in the late 16th century. Okay, so who are the Chichimec? The Chichimec is a broad term, kind of the same way we use the term Pueblo peoples. It included many peoples of many different ethnicities, including the Guachiles, the Pames, the Zacatecos, the Otomis, the Tepecanos, the Guameris, and the Coxcanes, as well as several others. And you can see them depicted here. Today, we would look at these peoples as living in central Mexico, just north, a couple hundred miles north of Mexico City. They were semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers, focusing on mesquite and agave. However, many also practiced agriculture, so they were not nomadic peoples in the sense of the way pre-contact Apache peoples were. Instead, they may have been more similar in many ways, as I said, to Pueblo peoples. And it's important to note that they are not a single culture. So using the word Chichimec is an inclusion of multiple groups. They all spoke different languages, but they were all within the Uto-Aztecan family. So they were very similar to Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs. But unlike the Aztecs, by most Mesoamerican standards, they were uncivilized because they did not aggregate into large cities. They did not wear elaborate clothing. They wore a loincloth, and they revered the moon, as it were, in some historical accounts. The Chichimec also bordered along next to two major empires. We can see those empires illustrated here. The first one in kind of that purplish gray color is the Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance. And then the green one in the west were the Tarascans, or the Pure Pecha. You'll notice that the Tlaxcalans are not illustrated here. The Tlaxcalans were a confederacy. In fact, they represent that light gray piece that seems to be absent from the Aztec Empire just east of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs may have been descendants of the Chichimec as well as the Toltec. Both of their origin stories say they came from the north, and they were a barbaric and warlike peoples. Likely those peoples, though some people have placed their origins as far north as New Mexico, more likely these were types of Chichimec peoples that had existed north of what became the Aztec Empire originally. And as they moved south, they adopted greater and greater Mesoamerican cultural traits, and eventually they took over control of most of Mesoamerica. Now, the initial conquest of the New World, I'm not going to describe in any detail. Of course, we see that starting with Christopher Columbus against the Taino, and of course the Carib. And this was actually one of the other talks we did in this lecture series, is to speak about these people in detail. But for this, it's important to note that the Taino and Carib populations were largely eradicated, unfortunately, due to warfare and disease by the early 1500s. And of course, the Spanish had moved into conquering the Valley of Mexico by the early 16th century. And of course, during the campaign, 3 to 4 year campaign, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies captured the capital of Tenochtitlan, and with it the Aztec Empire. And this was the foundation for what would become the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which was eventually established in 1535. In an account, I can't, obviously, this lecture is not the place to talk about the conquest of the Valley of Mexico. However, I believe this paragraph kind of sums up the entire conquest of the Valley of Mexico in a very short, concise way. This comes from one of the characters we'll be talking about today. During the course of what they term the conquest, the Europeans have, throughout these 450 leagues, butchered, burned alive, or otherwise done to death 4 million souls, young and old alike, men, women, and children. In no account, no matter how lengthy, no matter how long it took to write, or how conscientiously it was compiled, could possibly do justice to the full horror of these atrocities committed at one time or another in various parts of this region by the mortal enemies of the human race. And by that, he means the Spanish conquistadors. What came out of the conquest of the Valley of Mexico was eventually the Viceroyalty of New Spain. It's important to note that this is not the modern-day state of Mexico. Mexico is not the equivalent of New Spain. Those words are not interchangeable. New Spain included a very vast region. If you notice, it includes most of North America, most of Central America, and it even included the Philippines and the Caribbean. So it was a very, very big empire. But it was managed separately. It's interesting to note that the Philippines was managed from Mexico City. However, Panama, which is obviously much closer than the Philippines, was managed not from Mexico City. So you have this great kingdom within the Spanish Empire, which stretches over a vast amount of land, but it is not equivalent to Mexico, nor does the Mexico of 1846, the Mexico that went to war with the United States, represent the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Other portions of the Viceroyalty had already broken off. The Philippines never left the Spanish Empire, whereas other areas of Central America left of their own fruition. So this state, this management unit within the Spanish Empire did not exist when the U.S. Army got involved and when the United States got involved in New Mexico. And for our story, we only really need to focus on one of these kingdoms within this viceroyalty, and that is the one called New Galicia. Today, this is the modern-day states of Nayarit, Jalisco, Colima, Aguas Calientes, and Zacatecas, as well as a little bit of Sonora. You can see the modern-day states of Mexico right there. If you'll notice, that's pretty much the central west coast in central highlands of present-day Mexico. That was the kingdom of New Galicia. And for New Galicia's story, we actually don't, it's not centered around the conquest of Cortez, but a man that came after him in the Guzman expedition of 1529 to 1531. The Guzman expedition, Nuño Beltran de Guzman succeeded Hernan Cortez as the head of the Audiencia in the Americas. This is even before New Spain is developed. And in 1529, he set out to outdo Cortez by conquering areas west of the Valley of Mexico. With about 500 conquistadors and thousands of Nahua-speaking allies, probably mostly Aztec and Tlaxcalans, he set out to make a name for himself. His defined goal his conquest was, of course, to find Cibola, the 7 cities of gold. That sounds familiar. It's because that was almost every other conquistador's goal, was to find these fictional 7 cities. And with his story and his narrative, it began with the sacking of the Tarascan Empire. So while as the Aztecs had fell in 1521, the Tarascans, who were technically a ally of the Spanish, fell to Guzman, even though they weren't resisting Guzman, in 1529. It begins and ends with the execution of the king Tangxuan II. We actually have an account of Tangxuan's death. This also coming from Las Casas. Regarding Tangxuan, this lord had a reputation of being extremely wealthy and having much gold and silver. So the Spanish seized him and proceeded to torture him. They put him in fetters and tied his hands to a plank which ran the full length of his body. Then they lit a brazier under the soles of his feet and had a lad with a hyssop filled with oil sprinkle them from time to time to ensure a nice, even roasting. On one side of the hapless victim stood a tormentor holding an armed crossbow and pointed at his heart, while a second stood holding a wild dog which constantly snapped at him and which could have torn him to pieces in the twinkling of an eye. If that sounds familiar, that's exactly the same torture Coronado would use later on the Turk, minus the fire. Tangxuan obviously did not live past his injuries of that torture. But after they were done with the Tarascans, they didn't stop. In fact, as they moved north, they found fewer and fewer settlements with which to raid. And eventually the whole expedition devolved into some sort of slaving operation. There was little organized resistance against the Guzman expedition. Remember, the first people he conquered were actually his allies. He marched in and tortured the king into giving him gold and silver till he died. And then they just didn't install a new king. The largest battle occurred in Sinaloa, but the big event for this narrative happened in January 1531. Guzman wanted a new city founded in what is today the location of Guadalajara. So he ordered his captain, Cristobal de Onate, to do so. And Onate founded the city. And this act, this establishing of this city, is really how Guzman carves out his kingdom of Nueva Galicia. And we have an account of the founding of the city, of course. Onate, one of this man's companion in arms, Onate, decided that he would have a wall built to enclose some land he acquired. Imported 8,000 native to work unpaid and unfed on this project, and took not a blind bit of notice when one after another they dropped dead of hunger. That is Las Casas' interpretation of the founding of Guadalajara. Is that Onate literally takes 8,000 natives, makes them build the city unpaid and unfed, and they eventually die as a result. Then they wrap up the expedition. They decide that all the natives who have not died, which there isn't many of them, but then these are their allies, obviously. I want to make that clear. The natives who resisted them died on the battlefield. The natives who came with them were brought into shackles. In fact, this is a great quote from Garcia del Pilar, who was on the expedition with Guzman. He records this in terms of discussing Guzman and Onate. Then all the Indians we had brought with us were distributed among the Spaniards in lots of 4 and 10. Each Spaniard shackled his, and the Indians were even sold among them. Of the 1,200 Tlaxcalans who went with us, no more than 20 survived, and those are in chains. So you either died on the expedition or you were put into slavery. This did not sit well with the indigenous peoples of Nueva Galicia. In fact, Guzman's expedition was bad. In fact, it should be noted that the Spanish authorities sent a new representative to found New Spain. They sent Antonio de Mendoza in 1535. Upon his arrival, he arrested Guzman and sent him back to Spain to answer for his crimes. It's important to note that they did not, his actions were brutal even by Spanish standards. And Guzman, for his part, served several years in jail and dies in poverty. Interestingly, Onate gets off. Onate is not punished. But he's also removed from a position of power. So even though he can't be necessarily blamed for what Guzman did, he was only following orders, he's taken out of power. They're told, you cannot be in charge of Guadalajara. And instead, Mendoza places his man in charge. He places a man by the name of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado as the new governor of Nueva Galicia. The Coronado family, Coronado was a patron of Mendoza, and Mendoza, even though he doesn't like what Guzman's done, he's already laying his own plans to conquer even further north. Now, I want to pause for a minute here and talk about some of the similarities and differences between Cristobal Onate, the father of our founder of New Mexico, and Coronado. They're both very similar in many ways and both very different. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was born in Salamanca around 1510. He was Castilian. He arrived in the New World in 1535 with his patron Mendoza. He's really new. A new and young guy. I mean, he's only 25 when he arrives in the New World. Onate was also very young when he arrived in the New World. He was born in 1504, but he's of Basque origin. So he is from the northeastern portions of of what is we would call today Spain. He arrived in 1524, so right after the conquest of the Valley of Mexico. He actually came working on serving as an auditor on Cortez's affairs to make sure the money that Cortez was giving the crown was sufficient. And then later he worked under Guzman. So he had been in the New World at the time when Coronado arrives for about 10 years. And he's in his 30s now. Both are very young. Both are Northerners. They both come from, even though they're Castilian and Basque, they're both Northerners. They were both born to lower aristocratic families, and both were considered up-and-comers within Spanish government. The differences come in that Onate had worked for many different patrons. Certainly their ethnicities, Basque versus Castilian, were very, very different. Those are two groups that are very different today. Their time in the New World was also substantially different. And Onate had a much more military experience, having been part of the Guzman expedition than Coronado did. Mendoza makes good on his plans to go north. He can't go north himself, but he sends his patron, Coronado, to go find, of course, the goal is to find Cibola, the 7 cities of gold. And he grants Coronado, he helps funds this expedition, which includes possibly as many as 400 Spanish conquistadors and a couple thousand Native American allies or auxiliaries. And unfortunately, Coronado comes north, and we probably know, everybody should know this story. He doesn't find the wealth he was envisioning. He ends up having a disastrous 2 years up here in New Mexico, where he explores much of North America, a substantial portion in North America, but he does not find the wealth that he wanted to find. Instead, he finds indigenous resistance in the Tiwa War. He finds the Great Plains. One of his men explores the Grand Canyon, but it doesn't end well for him. To bankrupt, and there was a lot of bad. To be clear, the Coronado Expedition was a picture-perfect example of poor choices. First of all, Coronado pretty much put everything he had into this expedition, along with Mendoza helped him too, but Coronado put all of his money in it. He also stripped the area of Nueva Galicia of all of its fighting men. So he pretty much took every Spanish fighting man and every close Native American ally he could to travel north with him. The only person he didn't want to take with him was Onate. He didn't want to share the glory with Onate. Remember, Onate wasn't in favor with these guys. So they left Onate to handle the rear guard. They left him in Guadalajara. They also, in addition to all this, they actually funded a second expedition to take place at exactly the same time as Coronado. They actually had a mission along the coast led by Hernando de Alarcón, who who's supposed to meet up with Coronado and resupply the expedition, and it fails miserably. Absolutely fails miserably. Meanwhile, while Coronado moves north, the atrocities continue. We have this account of the atrocities that continue in 1540 from Las Casas. This is likely what occurred to initiate the Mixton War. And it's told very vaguely. But one of his officers, one of Guzman's officers, probably Onate, was responsible for the indiscriminate slaughter of many locals, hanging some, burning others alive, and throwing yet others to wild dogs, sometimes sawing off their hands and feet, sometimes pulling out their tongues or hacking off their heads. It is said that this man, Onate, maybe, remember, he never mentioned, it's important to note that Casas never mentions anybody directly by name. It's only implied. Even Cortez is only implied in the narrative. Nobody is ever spoken of directly. Was directly responsible for looting and destruction of 800 towns and villages throughout the kingdom of Jalisco, the native name for New Galicia. Remember, it's interesting to note that Casas actually here uses the indigenous name for the region, and that it was because of his harsh treatment that the local people, seeing all of them perish under the Spanish yoke, were driven to despair and fleeing into the mountains, finally began to offer some measure of organized resistance. We know he's clearly mentioning the Mixton War and killing a handful of their oppressors, as in all justice they were entitled to do. So what Casas is saying is the Spanish were doing very terrible things to these people, and finally these people had had enough and they revolted. We think the activity that Las Casas is referencing here in the archives is actually an event in the spring of 1540 in which 18 Chichimec leaders suspected of conspiring against the Spanish were arrested and 9 were hanged. So the Spanish get wind that there could be a revolt. They gather up these leaders and they kill half of them. And of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you kill their leaders, they rise up and revolt. A group of Coxcanes respond to the killing, respond to the deaths of their leaders by killing and possibly eating encomendero Juan Arce near Nochislan. They're guided by a charismatic leader known as Francisque Tamatzali. And I apologize, I'm going to butcher these Nahuatl names, but just bear with me here. Tamatzali in the Coxcanes, then after possibly eating Juan Arce and certainly killing him, retreat to their ancestral stronghold of Nochislan on Cerro del Tuche. This is that hill today. So this is actually the hill they retreat to. Word reaches Onate that Juan Arce is dead, and of course he sends out a group from Guadalajara to just kind of quell the rebellion. He doesn't even think much of it, but he gets to this hill and he attacks it. He sends up hilariously enough a priest and some soldiers who die and they get attacked. Onate then, after seeing his failed attempt at making peace and just getting him to come down, retreats back to Guadalajara. He realizes that the situation is not very good. And when he retreats back to Guadalajara, of course, this victory encourages other indigenous peoples to also rebel. So what starts off as just a small rebellion at Nochislan kind of spreads throughout the region as other Coxcanes and Zacatecas join the rebellion. And Onate, who has at this point absolutely no soldiers, writes to Viceroy Mendoza in Mexico City and pleads for aid. And he writes to a whole bunch of people. He writes to Mendoza mostly, but he writes to a whole bunch of people. He sends it all over the place. Help. I need help. Will anybody save us? The Red Sun hears us call. Pedro Alvarado had been and we've had a separate lecture on him, had been an associate of Onate. He knew Onate. Onate was a young man, an up-and-comer when Pedro Alvarado was destroying the Highland Maya. Pedro Alvarado sitting in his capital in Guatemala, which, remember, that's a word. If you remember the other talk, that's a word that was created, a kingdom that was created out of nothing for Pedro Alvarado. He gets the letter that says they need help in the north, and he had been building an army at that time anyways to go it lead an invasion of China in the Spice Islands. And it does say China in the narrative. However, it's probably likely that this is referring to the Philippines, which will be colonized shortly thereafter. He takes his force, drops everything, and heads north. And he's got 100 or so Spanish soldiers, maybe as many as 400. He's got a substantial force and several thousand Native American allies. Most of these at this point would have been Highland Maya, though he would have had some Nahuatl-speaking men as well. He takes his whole force and arrives at Guadalajara to help Onate. Now, I've used this quote many times before, but this is a good indication of Alvarado's character. So who's coming to Onate's aid? This is involving his conquest of the Maya regions, but it gives you an idea how his army worked. Since he never fed the 10 or 20,000 impressed natives in his army, he gave them leave to eat the prisoners they took, thus setting the royal seal of approval on the establishment in his camp of human arbiter, where he himself would preside over the slaughter and grilling of children, and where grown men were butchered for the sake of their hands and feet, which were generally held to be the best cuts. Take this as you will, but he was referred to amongst his followers as Tonata, the sun god, because of his reddish blonde hair. But it may have also been in Tonata, which I'm probably butchering the Nahuatl word, was a god that many Aztecs sacrificed to. So take that as it were. Some of this probably did occur in his camp. Mendoza finds out Alvarado's coming and says, "Do not do anything, Alvarado. Stay back." Alvarado, who doesn't like Mendoza, who feels that he's an equal of Mendoza in many ways, decides to just go march off and fight this battle on his own. So he goes back to that hill where Onate had left earlier. And this is an overview of some of the alignments on that hill as viewed today. This is some really amazing research that it was done by primarily Mexican archaeologists, but also with the assistance of a New Mexico archaeologist by the name of Elizabeth Oster. And what you can see here with these alignments is that the hill is very fortified. It looks like a castle, right? You have concentric wall inside of wall inside of wall. Now, Alvarado has a fairly large army, but it's nothing compared to the 15,000 Coxcanes led by Tamatzali and Zacatecas led by Don Diego that are behind these stone walls. Alvarado decides not to wait for any assistance. He orders the assault on these guys. Alvarado has a single cannon. He uses it to breach the walls and then orders his pikemen and auxiliaries forward. Big, massive army kind of goes up the hill. They get about halfway up and they're firing these musket balls and crossbow bolts, which look identical to the ones used during the Coronado Expedition. They're firing at these indigenous peoples. They make it about halfway up the hill till they realize they just cannot get past those defenses. Alvarado, not to be undone, he gets on his horse, and he was famous for riding a white horse. I don't know if the horse he had at this point, it certainly wasn't the same horse. I hope not. That horse would have been really old at this point. I don't know how long horses live. A white horse, he was famous for riding a white horse. So he gets on top of his horse and he rides out to rally his troops. And of course, something happens. The horse spooks or another soldier. At any rate, he ends up getting under his horse. And crushed. And, when a charismatic leader, in this case, Alvarado, who's believed by some of his followers to actually be the son of a god, actually falls in battle, it doesn't bode well for you. That's not the good omen you want, right? They start to retreat. The Coxcanes follow up. It ends up being a rout. Alvarado's army is destroyed. They all flee back into Guadalajara. Here's Alvarado's death as depicted in indigenous artwork of the time. We see Alvarado there. You can even see the little sun coming off him. He's dead. He dies several days later. He ends up being buried not that near, but semi-close to the battlefield, and then is eventually reinterred in Guatemala, where he's buried today. This course continues the uprising. People are very encouraged by this. They're so emboldened. The Coxcanes and Zacatecas rally and they attack Guadalajara in September. But Onate and the defenders are able to repulse the attack. So even though this indigenous uprising is going good, they're not able to capture Guadalajara, thanks in large part to Onate's defense. And Tamatzali retreats back to Nochixtlan as word spreads that a very large army has arrived from the Valley of Mexico. Now, there's an old saying that if you need something done right, it's best to do it yourself. Well, we'll get there in a second, I guess. This is a great quote about Alvarado's death, as comes from Casas, and I love to read this quote, so I'm going to do it right now. If one could calculate how many tears were shed and how many sighs and anguish groans were caused by his actions, how much grief he occasioned in life, and how many souls he consigned to eternal damnation in the life hereafter, not only the countless hordes of natives, but also the Christian wretches whose association with him led them to commit vile atrocities, moral sins, and inhuman barbarity. May God have mercy on him, and may he be satisfied with the terrible death which he visited on him. That's what Casas thought of Alvarado's death. It was totally justified. God made it happen. So Mendoza's got to do it himself, right? It's going back. Mendoza arrives with the largest army the area's ever seen. He may only have about 450 soldiers, but backing those 450 Spanish soldiers up is 30 to 60,000 Aztec and Tlaxcalan allies. In fact, this is an image of the Mixton War, a contemporaneous image. Here we can see Mendoza on his horse, but you'll notice that most of the guys fighting for Mendoza are in full Aztec regalia. These are the special forces of the Aztec Empire, and they're fighting off against the Coxcanes here that we see set up on the hill. He uses his overwhelming force to pretty much dismantle all operation. He goes from settlement to settlement, crushing all opposition to him. We can see some of those settlements that were taken by Mendoza here. He pretty much destroys Nochixtlan, the center of this battle so far, on November 9th, 1541, and captures Tamatzali, but he ends up escaping. He then spends the remainder of 1541 and early 1542 kind of mopping up the resistance. Mendoza, for his part, his own atrocities, was accused of executing non-combatants, primarily women and children, with cannon, dog, and sword. So he certainly was without his own atrocities. I'd like to just point out here that while I cannot spend too much time on the atrocities, it's important to note that every conquistador I mentioned in this talk was accused of committing large-scale atrocities against indigenous peoples. So while there are certainly shades of gray, maybe Alvarado's at the higher end of evil, there's nobody that's without problems here. And that's a problem with war in general, but it's certainly evidenced as to how the Spanish operated during this time period in New Spain. The war's over by the late spring of 1542. Mendoza is investigated for war crimes. And nothing really comes of it. Tamatzali kind of flees into the hills, as it were. And the results of the war, unfortunately, is that Nuevo Galicia is largely depopulated. There's very few people left alive in it. The people that live there can't really grow anything. All the fields are burned. Production's at a standstill. It's a disaster. The entire countryside is a disaster. And this is what Coronado returns to. So he returns having invested all of his money into this journey north, only to find out the area that he should be returning to, that he should be able to draw an income from, and which should serve him very well, is a disaster. And so he's welcomed home to a mountain of debt in a destitute province. And in 1544, Mendoza, remember, who was charged with war crimes, then charges his own associate, Coronado, with misuse of funds and war crimes. And they're primarily leveled at Coronado because of his inability to pay Mendoza back for both the expedition and the cost of the Mixton War. Mendoza had to muster that army himself to go put it down. He wants to get paid for this. Coronado is cleared of all charges, but dies in 1556. But but it's important to note that by 1544, he's kind of out of the picture. Well, who should arrive back in the picture? Onate. So at the same time, things aren't going good for Coronado, Onate is now a hero. He saved Guadalajara. He uses this prestige to increase his wealth and stature, including his land holdings. And then he gets super lucky. All those areas that have been depopulated by Native Americans, he's kind of checking it out with his buddies, and they discover silver on that land. They discover a big cache of silver in and around Zacatecas. And Onate officially establishes the city of Zacatecas and the Panuco mine in January of 1548. So Coronado's out of the picture. Onate's becoming extraordinarily wealthy. So New Galicia goes from being a war-torn no man's land to being one of the most important provinces in all of New Spain. Onate, Tolosa, and Ibarra, the guys who discover this silver, become some of the richest men too. And so they import new settlers. They import primarily Tarascans to colonize the area. They remember the Tarascans were that poor state which the king was a friend, but unfortunately they wanted gold, and so they killed him. Well, they take those guys that are still hanging around to the south, and they bring them up to work the mines. This has a problem. When you get a lot of money, you get something called inflation. And while I'm not an economic expert, what I can tell you is the few people that were living in the area could no longer afford to live in that area, and they became very disenfranchised. These are the Chichimec tribes, right? And so what happens is there's another round of hostilities. It begins in late 1550 when the Zacatecos attack a supply train carrying primarily Tarascan Indians en route to Zacatecas. So these Chichimecs are upset that these new peoples are being brought in to work the land. And so it's largely indigenous upon indigenous conflict. By 1551, other Chichimec tribes, including the Guachile and the Guamares, join in the fighting. They're primarily targeting shipments in and out of the mines. So they're not going after there's no large armies in this second resistance. It's a guerrilla war. They're attacking exposed populations. They're also primarily attacking other indigenous peoples. Interestingly, the Coxcanes, who are almost obliterated at this point, support the Spanish, along with the Tarascans and Otomis. And these guys, for their support of the Spanish, are given European weapons. So pretty much, if you'll side with us, we'll give you horses, we'll give you guns, we'll show you how to kill your own people. So it becomes a great indigenous conflict in the area. Now, the Coxcanes' support of the Spanish puts Tomatzli in a horrible position. Remember, he's still technically a war criminal. He surrenders under an assumed name to the Bishop of New Galicia, who eventually figures out who he is and sends him to Spain to await trial. Tomatzli is actually first jailed at Valladolid, which at that point is the capital of the Spanish Empire, but is eventually moved to the Dominican convent of San Pablo, where he meets Bartolomeu de las Casas. Now, I've used a lot of quotes up to Las Casas at this point, but it's okay to give a quick review of who Las Casas is. Las Casas is a Dominican priest. For a time, he was the protector of the Indians in the New World, and he is the one who wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which is primarily what I quoted up to this point, though I did give some quotes from Garcia del Pilar and several other folks in this talk. He wrote it for the future King Philip II, but then later just published the book for everyone in 1552. He defended the Native Americans in the Valladolid debates. And he was an enemy of the Franciscans under Toribio Benavente, better known as Motolina. And really the division amongst the Dominicans and Franciscans focused on whether Native Americans deserve to be protected. And this is a very, very simple and not specific summary of it, but pretty much the Dominicans and Las Casas argued that if you protected the indigenous peoples, they would eventually come around and adopt Christianity. Whereas the Franciscans argued to the benefit of the Spanish court, which the Spanish court sided with the Franciscans on this, argued that The indigenous peoples of the New World should accept Christianity, and once they accepted Christ into their heart, or Christianity, they would be protected. Well, that doesn't seem like much of a difference. It means a lot, because it means you can do really terrible things to them if they haven't accepted Christianity. Whereas if you decided you could not do terrible things to them, and that would then out of the goodness of their heart, they would take Christianity. Those are very different things. The Franciscan point of view could lead to additional atrocities. However, it's important to note there was many more. The discussion is much more complicated than that, and Franciscans don't not necessarily believe that today. And they probably would say that I'm misquoting Motilina in this argument, or other Franciscan authorities, and so I take all of that with a grain of salt. Las Casas becomes moved by Tomatzali's story and actually decides to defend him in the Spanish court starting in July of 1555. Casas argues a couple different things. First of all, he argues that this indigenous man should have all the rights afforded a vassal of the King of Spain. Remember, this is a political leader amongst the Coxcanes. He accuses, instead he throws it over. He argues in his defense that the people who should really be charged are Guzman, Onate, and Ibarra for exploiting and murdering the Indians. These are subjects of the crown. And he declares that the Mixton War was a natural justice brought on by the conquest of New Galicia. So he argues that Tomatzali was fully within his right to do this. That this was a natural, this was brought about by the Spanish treatment of the entire affair. However, it's important to note that even though Las Casas defends him against Motilina's policies, he'd already lost favor. And by the time he argues this, nobody's listening to Las Casas. He does his best to defend Tomatzali, but unfortunately, no sentence is issued either way. And Tomatzali actually dies in custody circa 1556, probably of some sort of European infectious disease. Onate is not charged, obviously. Meanwhile, the war continues. The guerrilla war continues. By 1562, it's estimated that about 200 Spaniards and 2,000 Indian allies and traders had been killed by the Chichimec rebels. It's going crazy out there. The Pames actually joined the rebellion in the 1570s, but by then the war's already turning in the Spanish favor. The Franciscans, under the policies first articulated by Motilina, begin a large-scale movement to missionize the Chichimec. Remember, they pretty much say, if you don't like war, accept Christ. And a lot of people buy into that. But they also do a little bit of moving the ethnicities of the people around. They bring in more families from central Mesoamerica, from the Valley of Mexico, and from the area of Tlaxcala to settle the area, to settle amongst the rebellious tribes. So they bring in peoples that are more familiar with Spanish customs, indigenous peoples that are used to going to church. And they bring these people in, and it works. These new Tlaxcalans, they're farmers. Things kind of calmed down. And by 1590, the hostilities have really ended. The Chichimec War the Mixton War kind of began with a boom and ended with a boom. The Chichimec War kind of just fizzles out. So what's Onate's legacy in this? Well, he dies before the battle's actually done. But it's important to note that he served as governor of New Galicia 3 times during his lifetime. He's credited with founding 4 major cities in what is today Mexico. Those are Compostela, Tepic, Guadalajara, and Zacatecas. And he was survived by multiple children, including twin boys Juan and Cristobal. Cristobal Onate, the senior, established one of the richest dynasties in the New World, lasting for over 300 years. And no charges, even though he had a part in all of this, no charges were ever filed against him for any of his actions. So where do we go from there? Well, the Chichimec War ends. It's time to look north again. And King Philip II, at this point, who has ignored Las Casas, right, is looking for a guy that can do it, a guy that can go north and settle it and make it successful. And he knows that he believes that the guy to do that is Cristobal Onate's son, Juan de Onate, who we have a statue of here. Onate, along with his retinue of Franciscan priests and possibly Tlaxcalan, though some of them could have been Tarascans, settlers set out to colonize the Pueblo lands in 1598. Here, the story would just do a replay. Abuses suffered by the indigenous peoples would once again lead to a Native American uprising. But that's a story with different characters. And we can see the uprising that's coming in New Mexico. I hope you've enjoyed this and found it entertaining, but I'm happy to answer some questions as best I can.
Matt Gale Stevens, how big was the slave component in the mines in Zacatecas, in the silver mines?
I don't know. There's a short answer. I don't know how much it was. I would bet that many contemporary sources today, especially in a more liberal time frame, would articulate there was lots of them. However, I would argue that perhaps a more conservative number is needed. Most of the Tarascans and Tlaxcalans and Mexica, which are brought in to work the mines, appear to have done these transports appear to be made willingly. These people tend to be colonizing. And the reason I say that, and the reason I would make the argument that many of them are coming, maybe as slave labor, but also possibly as indigenous people, is that the pottery of the time period, Aztec 4 or Guadalajara polychrome, is actually named after the city of Guadalajara, even though it's a continuation of Aztec pottery. It's made by Mexica potters probably living in and around Guadalajara in the 17th century. So they could be slaves, but many more of them could have also been free workers. We don't know what the actual numbers of those are. And I'm not aware, and now mind you, my knowledge specifically about the mines at Zacatecas, other than what I just told you here, which is some broad pieces, that is not something I know as much about. So I would defer to somebody who knows that region more.
Okay. Thank you.
You did make a comment about the Chichimecas just kind of petering out, the war petering out. When I was living in San Miguel de Allende, the Chichimecas are north of there and west of there. And every year they come into the cathedral or the large church, the parroquia, and they have a big dance and a festival and have beautiful feathers and all kinds of stuff. And what they celebrate is their conversion to Christianity, because that is what stopped the war in their opinion, because that was when they basically gave up. But there were so few of them that came in and finally became Christian because there was so much disease. And the starvation and the hardship of living out in the boondocks in the dry, rocky area, which is mostly north and west of there, was so difficult that over a period of time, they just couldn't do it anymore. But for a good, solid couple of decades, they would attack the Spaniards as they came into all those canyons and rocky areas, because they didn't have to be down in the bottom. They could attack them from the top. And that was one of the reasons it just kept going for so long. But really what killed them off or stopped the war was just the diseases and the food pressure.
Well, and I want to make clear, because you mentioned it too, that they celebrate their conversion to Christianity as bringing about the end of the war. That is specifically what I was trying to get in that slide when I said that the Franciscan priests were actually the commandos that ended the war by putting their missions out there and saying pretty much, if you want peace, you're going to convert. And it really did, and the resettling of other indigenous peoples in the area really did bring it down. I also want to point out, just as a public service announcement, my wife actually spent several months living in San Miguel de Allende when she was in her 20s. That is one of the most beautiful towns, cities in Mexico today. And I encourage, obviously with COVID, don't go out and visit San Miguel de Allende. But when things are better, it is one of the most beautiful places in the world to see, and I would encourage anybody that's interested in Mexican culture and in Mexican history to visit the city.
My question is, in listening to about the carnage and the horrible atrocities committed against other human beings, were there certain social structures or practices that caused such violence to be brought to the New World by the Spaniards. Not that natives also didn't have the capacity to have violence between them and among them, but is there any sort of psychological track that has been examined?
I would argue in two different lights. First of all, I would say, as somebody who studies the Spanish Empire, the Spanish in many, and I want to make this clear, it's not just the Spanish that, and we'll talk a little bit about early modern warfare in some lectures coming up. But to be clear, the Spanish committed atrocities not only in the New World, but in Asia and in Europe, and that it wasn't just the Spanish. The early modern world was a very, very violent and harsh place. And I want to make that clear. But one of the reasons now, that being said, I'm not justifying saying, well, the Spanish were no different from any other group. I want to be clear that I think in the case specifically of New Spain, what we see here is actually two different things. So we see the religious intolerance. We see the institutionalized violence of the Spanish or European armies, certainly forged in the Reconquista of Spain, certainly forged their expertise for killing, forged in the Italian wars, fought in Europe. But we also see indigenous practices that are being taken on by the Spanish. And so I don't want to just put the blame on the Spanish per se, but Mesoamerican cultures at this time period had a rich tradition of at least religious violence. In fact, there are actually calculations at how many people had to die for the Aztec world to continue to work every year. Like how many sacrifices they believed were necessary to make the world just continue to spin. Those cultural traits were exploited by the Spanish. And most of the people committing this violence, to be very, very clear and to be honest, were indigenous peoples against indigenous peoples. These armies are largely indigenous armies. However, they are now motivated by things they would have never been motivated before. So while as before they would have captured people for sacrifices in their temples, and it would be done as ritual violence, such as the flower wars that were fought between the Aztecs and Tlaxcala, what you're seeing now is the Aztecs being brought into a system of total war. And they are perpetrating their violence that they've always been capable of doing on a very, very large scale. And I want to be clear, these Aztec warriors were they were in many ways more professional as soldiers than the Spanish were. The Spanish were a mix of explorers, a mix of all these different things. These specialized Mexica and Tlaxcala warriors were pretty much the special forces of their times. They're not bringing up necessarily untrained armies. These are people that are very good at causing pain and suffering in others. And they've just been simply motivated to a new cause. And this was devastating, not only to the conquest of Mesoamerica, but these Mesoamerican indigenous peoples were brought to South America for their killing power. They were brought to the Philippines to kill, even to Cambodia. They were brought because they were so good at what they did. That's terrifying. I mean, in many ways, we can study Mesoamerican societies and say this is what would happen, once they were put onto a task by these European forces. So I think there's blame on both sides of this equation. I also think that that might be unfair to say in some ways, but I think it certainly is. And certainly the Chichimec tribes were themselves pretty aggressive peoples, even by the standards of the peoples of central Mexico at the time. These were rowdy, warlike and barbarian peoples. So the fact that they were able to win these battles against the Spanish is a testament to their own military prowess and their own violent traditions.
So Matt, you mentioned cannibalism when these Indios Amigos were not being fed. Could you talk to us a little bit about how prevalent cannibalism was prior to and after?
So we don't know. We don't know, and it depends on who you believe. So if you want to take two different, very, very different approaches. One is, first of all, it certainly happened. The question is the scale of it, right? So if you believe somebody like the anonymous conquistador, they were eating people all the time. In fact, there was nothing better than taking a piece of human, sprinkling some chili on top of it, and gobbling it down. Is that accurate? Probably not, right? That seems a little sensationalist. But the anonymous conquistador was certainly right in a lot of other ways. In fact, he's almost like an anthropologist in his discussion of Mesoamerican peoples. And certainly, it's not just Las Casas that's saying cannibalism exists. Lots of people. But the scale, like archaeologically, we do have evidence of cannibalism. We don't. The accounts, though, are few and far between. And I want to make that clear. So we don't know how prevalent it was. I mean, certainly human sacrifice was common prior to contact. That was probably put a little bit more, you don't do that so much now. How much they were eating people, we don't know. Now, mind you, I also want to point out something that there's certainly ritual cannibalism certainly existed in Mesoamerican societies. However, the real push by the Spanish in some of their accounts, certainly Las Casas accounts, is that these people were eating people because they were starving. And both types of cannibalism have existed in historical context, right? So you can get ritual cannibalism. We even talked about that in our Polish talk, right? Certainly some of the precursors to the Slavs in Central Europe, the Lusitanian culture, may have practiced cannibalism, ritual cannibalism of some form, leading to eventually the vampire myth. People do, but also we can look at things such as the Donner Party, right? In California is a very popular account. There's a practice of cannibalism because people are starving. They need to eat something. Both accounts, even if they were done by Mesoamerican Indians, were certainly sensationalized by the Spanish. It gives you a justification, right? You want to put if you're looking to create some sort of world order and you view cannibalism as a barbaric trait, you might say that your enemies practice cannibalism as a way of putting yourself higher up there. So what we might have in many cases is the opposite, which there could have been a few cases of cannibalism that the Spanish then promoted as a way of elevating themselves above the indigenous peoples, in many ways justifying in their mind the atrocities they were performing upon the indigenous populations. So it can go either way. I don't know what the correct answer is, other than I would say that yes, certainly cannibalism existed in Mesoamerica. It likely existed in many different contexts for different reasons. However, was it prevalent? I mean, is it like the anonymous conquistador says? Is Las Casas to be believed? I think those things are a little more open to debate as to how widespread that was. And also the reality is, even if it was widespread, I would caution against, I know your brain will probably instantly go there and say, well, that's a barbaric practice, right? But it was a part of their culture. So it's, even if it existed, I don't necessarily put a negative connotation to it. So we're going to be moving out of these discussions of conquistadors with the next couple talks. We'll be talking directly about historical and archaeological research in the early 20th century, these next couple talks. So I hope you've enjoyed these discussions of conquistadors. And I hope I've told you a couple stories that you may not have heard, hopefully, over these last couple as far as different ways of approaching the same history or the same time period. And if you'd like to learn more, I am not the expert on the Mixton War, but there are people out there you can learn a lot more about it, and I encourage you to do so. Also, I would also encourage everyone, as we move out of the Spanish colonial times and look at more modern history, as it were, specifically in New Mexico, with these talks, is to really embrace these archives. Many of these translations, I mean, many of these accounts are translated into English nowadays and are accessible. So as many of you are members of the docent community and researchers at Coronado Historic Site, I would encourage you to embrace these documents. That's it for me. I'm happy that people enjoy. I hope people enjoyed this lecture, and I'm happy to discuss more through emails.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Matt, very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye, guys.